we're going to talk today in this session about why you should start a podcast and why it's relevant. I'll turn it over to Matthew real quick and let him do some intros for himself.
I just want to remind everyone to rate this presentation, give it 5 stars, and share it with your friends. Yeah, smash that like button. Thank you, Patrick. My name is Matthew Kurbis. I'm the subscription attorney, but we have so much to cover today that, if you just go to MatthewKurbis.com, spelled like that, 1 T in Matthew, although if you spell with 2 T's, it redirects. And you could listen to all about myself. That's where I keep, when I go on other podcasts, I put it on that website. It's my speaker portfolio. And this is going to be more conversational. We have a deck today, but we're going to try to make this a little bit more interesting than just that we're talking at you at the presentation. So Patrick, I'll let you kick us off.
All right. Excellent. And so I will just say too, because I'm very cognizant that we want y'all to post in comments just because of this setup and because Matthew's going to be controlling the slide deck. I'm going to sit and he's going to stand. So just so y'all know, forgive that if it's a little awkward. The other thing I'll say is at the end, we're going to try to open this up to Q&A and we'll do our best because we don't have a mic for the audience because I've already seen one of the attendees has posted about that on Twitter. And so we're going to try to repeat the question so that everybody can hear it when we get to that. So just so you guys will know, but our intent is just to open this up. We've got an hour, give or take. And just so you know, there will be a break after this so that everyone knows. Okay.
When we conceived of this, it was a fireside chat with 2 cozy chairs.
That's right. And so, just pretend. And so, understanding that, I will just say this. If you can't or don't find the materials, like Matthew said, just email us. I promise you we have it. We'll send it to you. Just email us. All right. So, first question that I have for you, Matthew, is there's so many podcasts on the planet. Why would we want to start a podcast now?
I mean, here's the thing. Yes, there are a lot of podcasts. Most of them don't last more than 3 to 5 episodes. And they are out there. But one of the reasons why I think you want to is thinking about that in the inverse too, which is if you do and you just try and it's really bad, nobody's going to hear it. So it's okay, right? So it's the why, whatever the why is, you can have your own reason as to why, but don't let fear get in the way of doing it. Now, we, in the legal context, to answer the question of the why, usually it comes down to things that we're going to talk about today, right? Is it business development? Is it building brand recognition, brand affinity, which are different things? Do you want to show off your subject matter expertise? Are you going to be interviewing potential clients or interviewing potential referral partners of clients, right? So when you're thinking about this from a lawyer perspective, there's a heck of a lot of reasons to start a podcast, and it's capturing multiple things with one action, right? So you're going to be doing your business development anyway. Well, how about you record it and now it's content for social media or something else, right? So there's a lot of reasons as a lawyer that we should consider starting a podcast.
And so, some of the stuff that's on this slide deck, which I'll just run through because we're going to hit it, which is sort of strategies and name brand format, what equipment. It's kind of where I stop because I really like the equipment and how you do the setup and what software. And certainly Matthew is an expert on that. We're going to walk through that. How to record and publish episodes. We're going to talk about that. Going live. Booking guests. How do we do that? What should you do? If you can monetize it or not. And then sort of examples of workflow. So first on that list is sort of, does the name matter?
Absolutely, a name matters. And here are just, I have experience doing this stuff, so we'll skip past that. These materials will be available. And the lawyers, we all get it in the room, but I will be covering some things about some IP-related considerations when having guests on your show. It's not legal advice, just legal information. All right.
And you're recording this right now, too.
And we are recording this.
Yes. So I told Matthew when he started that, I'm like, wait a minute, you're miking up the mics. So we want to know what you're using on that. So we'll get to that.
But yeah, so we sort of talked about this. There's niche podcasting, right? Are we going to be doing it for marketing to customers, clients, having them as guests or referral partners? And then what's in a name, right? So when you're thinking about naming your podcast, you also want to think about, well, what's the format going to be, right? Because it's going to be relevant to it. Now, if you have a name brand for your firm or a trade name, and that's not just your name, for example, my name's Matthew Kurbis. My law firm is Subscription Attorney LLC. I've had some guests on my podcast that have some way better, more specific brands than my broad brand name, like Provider Legal, where they are a subscription law firm in California serving medical providers, right? So whatever your brand name is, your firm, sometimes in certain circumstances, that could be a good name for the podcast, especially if that's what you're trying to build awareness or brand awareness around. But it might not necessarily be that. Another example I like to give is there's the How to Contract platform. I think Laura Frederick comes to mind. That's her brand, her company to help lawyers learn how to contract. But her podcast is actually called You Can Contract, right? So it's like it rhymes a little bit with, there's synergy with her podcast name and her overall company's name. So there's different ways that you could approach it, but it also kind of depends. Are you just giving information? Are you interviewing guests? That might be part of that conversation that you have with either if it's just strategic partners, or if you're at a firm with other attorneys or staff people talking to them about it. You may want to change it to something else depending on what it is. Like my podcast is called Law Subscribed, which is in the subscription thing, but it's not related to my practice, and it doesn't have to be if you're just trying to build brand awareness.
And so let me ask you this on choosing a name. So let's say you come up with this really catchy name, right? Does it matter? I mean, how do I know that someone else is using it? Where do I go to check? How do you do that to see who your competition is?
Yeah. So again, it's one of these things where a lot of us are lawyers in the room. There are some serious IP considerations, right? So that's another reason why you might want to use your firm name, because you already have the IP rights in your firm name. But with podcasting in particular, unlike social media platforms where you could only get the @ handle for whatever's available or what you're willing to buy and somebody's willing to sell, in podcasting, you can have the same name of another podcast. So there's nothing preventing you technologically, like the handles on these other social media platforms, from doing that. You're definitely going to want to do a search on just whatever podcast app that you're listening to. One of the platforms we'll talk about is Substack, and that's one of these publishing platforms, but that's not necessarily going to just be publishing podcasts there. But in a Google search, you're not just going to find necessarily like a Substack newsletter that has the same name of the brand that you're considering using. So, if you're not an IP attorney and you've never done a search at the USPTO website, they're fairly straightforward. Again, no legal advice being given here, but you might want to consider doing a cursory search. Unless you're going to really want to monetize the podcast, spin it out as its own thing that's not directly connected to the firm, you might not want to spend the funds on hiring a trademark attorney to make sure that the brand is available. And if you pick something generic, it's probably not going to matter anyway, and it's probably not protectable.
And so we get this name. It's an amazing name, and then choosing a logo. So what do you do to brand it?
So I am about to launch a new podcast that I was trying to get it ready to announce for today, but I won't be able to. So follow @LawSubscribed and subscribe to the newsletter. But to see where that comes out. But I just used Gemini to create a logo, and I was amazed at the ability for this new tool. So Google Bard was the generative AI tool that Google had previously. They've rebranded to Gemini and released a lot more features. And so it's another form of prompt engineering. And I will tell you, I'm really good at the prompt engineering when it comes to the text-based AI, but I've had terrible results trying to figure out the image stuff. I'm not an artist. I'm not good at that. So previously, I would go to Canva, and Canva has some great tools available, and they've now incorporated AI into their features. You could type in, it's called like magic something. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but there's a way for you to sort of type in, this is why you want to figure out the name of the podcast first and the strategy around what is it going to be, a solo show, interview, figuring out what the goal is of why are we trying to market, whatever that is, and you feed that into these AI tools. And like I said, Gemini was really easy to use, and I actually like the results better than what I got on Canva. But what I did after I got that logo from Gemini is I took it into Canva, and then I messed around with it and edited it from there. These are really user-friendly tools. They have excellent FAQs, and if you're not sure how to use them, go to YouTube and you could ask, how do I use Gemini to create a logo for my podcast? You'll get plenty of, I don't know, Gemini just came out, but you'll get a lot of ways to do that. But those are tools I personally just used to make a new logo for a podcast that I'm working on, Gemini and Canva.
And so I've got another tip on that too, which is I've just used Fiverr like a couple days ago to do a rebrand on a firm logo, and it's just part of the package. They gave me social media strategy, logo, thumbnails. It was just all part of the deal. It's relatively cheap, so you might want to also check out Fiverr if you're looking to have that logo done. Should I do a different logo for every episode?
That's a really good question. I don't even think I specifically cover that in this presentation, in the slides. So you can do different images for each episode. And it sort of depends on, again, what's the goal of the podcast? Is it actually going to be generating business for the firm? Are you just trying to do brand affinity? Do you want your guests to share it with their audience? They are good potential referral partners for your business. An example is I have a prospective client that is starting a business and is going to do acupuncture. And we talked about doing a podcast for his business development where he's going to interview chiropractors. Because if somebody's interested in going and seeing a chiropractor, then they're already open to alternative medicines to go do acupuncture. So for someone like him, he'll have a logo for his podcast, but he's going to want to put a picture of his guest as that image for that episode to make it even more appealing for that guest to share it with his potential patients as well. So you definitely, depending on the software that you're using or the publication platform you're using, Spotify for podcasters, you do this, Apple Podcast lets you do this, and Substack let you do this. Some of them do, some of them don't. You can go in and customize it. It's going to be a little extra work, right? So are you doing this solo? Because like today's presentation this is a do-it-yourself thing, or if you are going to outsource and you just want to have a better understanding of what the outsource provider is doing for your podcast, like that's what we're talking about today. But if you're not going to give this to a staff person or otherwise outsource it, it's a lot of extra work and probably not worth it.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So when we're talking about setting this up, you're talking about it being a like publicly facing podcast.
Oh, yeah.
And so we were talking about this in some of our discussions, which was the difference between a public podcast and a private podcast that you use just to sort of curate your tribe. And so I've seen a couple of people in this space that are running their own sort of private podcast to, sort of build their brand and to build their following. Do you have any comments on that?
Another excellent question, Patrick. So there's different ways that you could do that. There are some third-party platforms that you have to pay something to do that. Substack lets you do it for free. They don't even have to be paid subscribers. You could just tier, like do different tiers of subscribers within Substack. And you could have a paid subscription, but you could just also wave them in so they don't have to pay. And they will get, as part of their subscription to you on Substack, they'll get a private RSS feed that sends you to a link for you to open it in your preferred podcast app. So if these are clients, I had a guest on my podcast, the co-founder of Law Pods, I think Robert Ingalls, and this was something that he sort of put out there. Well, if you're going to have a subscription law firm, which I do, one of the subscriber benefits could be a subscriber-only podcast. And you could also use this for other internal firm things for a knowledge base, right? Depending on, there's other ways to do that. You could do that through a podcast and a private podcast feed, but the tools are easier than ever, and it doesn't have to cost you anything to do a private podcast.
Okay, so I probably don't know any lawyer who doesn't have a website. And so we have a website. Should we put that podcast on our website, or what's your recommendation on that?
All right, it's the first "it depends" that I've actually said during this presentation. All of it depends, right? If it depends on your website is designed. If your website is designed so it's easy to add a tab that's podcasting or public speaking or some sort of other sort of tab on there, and again, it depends on what's the goal of the podcast. Are potential clients going to come to your website to listen to the podcast? Or is it going to be more of your pipeline to, once you get a potential client's email, you also want them to subscribe to the podcast kind of a thing? I'm a big fan of less is more. And so my personal recommendation would probably be have it be its own site, or through like a site like Substack for only $50, a one-time payment on Substack. By the way, Substack does not sponsor this presentation. I wish they did, but they don't. They don't even do affiliate links because they have just such great natural product-led growth. But one-time $50 payment, and you can have a custom URL for the Substack page, so it's not going to be podcast name or newsletter name.substack.com. It's a one-time $50 payment. It's a no-brainer for a law firm to pay that, and you have to use a subdomain. So I'm a big fan of dropping the www, but I have to use it because of the way Substack integrates it with the domain. So your firm, for example, if this is what you want to do, you can, because Substack is so much more than just a podcast publishing platform. In fact, that was an add-on, and they just added on video only a few months ago. They're a newsletter first platform. And so what you could do is you could have media.firmname.com. So it's actually another website, and you could link to it from your website, but I want to steer, my recommendation is don't just make it like another page on your website. Make it its own unique website with its own unique subdomain. You could do podcast.firmname.com. If you have a totally different brand, like in the how to contract, you can contract example, you could have just youcancontract.com as a totally owned separate URL as well if you didn't want to do a subdomain.
Okay. And so we'll probably wrap some more like comments on format strategies and brand strategy as we move along, but I want to move into some of the cool stuff, which is equipment. And so let's talk about equipment and sort of tell everybody what your recording space is.
Okay, yeah. So my recording space is, I have a not supposed to be a walk-in closet sized closet that you can fit a small desk a little bit larger than this podium in. And what I've done is I have, it's not in this deck, but in the materials, and we could pull up a PDF of it. I do have included in the materials literally all of my hardware and software stack for podcasting that I actually use. And I have sound blankets that wrap around the walls, with the sound blanket behind me being a green screen sound blanket. And then I have a microphone, a Shure MV7 microphone mounted to the ceiling using a ceiling mount with a boom arm, because what that does is that reduces vibrations into the microphone. So if it's just on a boom arm on a desk, then you're going to see it on camera. But my mic is actually off camera about this far away, and for the recording, that's about a hang loose distance away from my mouth, and that's called mic technique. And in the voiceover and voice acting industry, that's what is typically recommended, is about this far away from your microphone. So I set it up so that it's off camera, because after all, we're lawyers. This is podcasting for lawyers. If I am going, and by the way, the alternative title of this is how to learn how to fail at podcasting. We'd have a great virtual law firm set up. So if I'm appearing on Zoom court or with a prospective client meeting, I don't want my microphone on camera. That's less professional. And so another thing that I have is from the microphone is an extension cord to behind the ear headphones so that you can't see my headphones. I mean, you can kind of see it because I'm bald and I don't have any hair to cover like the little bit that you could see, but it looks far more professional. Some of the equipment can be expensive and we don't want to get wrapped up in the expensive equipment. And I did not buy everything to get started right away. I started with practically nothing. And as the podcast took off and I learned more about it and my firm started to do well, I started to buy more expensive equipment. But these behind the ear headphones are like $11 or $12 on Amazon. It's a no-brainer. You should be using them right now.
I've looked. They are $11 or $12, so they're pretty cool.
I have 3 pair just in case they ever break, and they've never broken, and I've been using it for years. So recording space, right? And I think this is like a really important thing because everyone thinks, well, I want the microphone and I want the fancy everything. But you could have your iPhone. I don't know. I'm sure there's a setting for Android phones too. But in your iPhone, you could go to your settings and then in settings go to voice memos. So you're in your voice memo settings and there's an option to do lossless audio capture. And even that will be a pretty decent microphone that using some of the software tools we'll talk about as part of the tech stack will just make it sound excellent. Your recording space is way more important than a fancy microphone. If you have the most expensive microphone on the market and you're recording in an echoey room like this, which even kind of has some soft panelings, like it's not actually the worst place. I recorded an episode for my podcast in one of these rooms already. And if your recording space is good and you have a so-so microphone, you're gonna have a really good sounding podcast. Nobody listens to podcasts and says, well, this audio is great. But if it's bad, they're going to think it's bad and they're going to stop listening. The recording space is the #1 most important thing.
This is a good point to drop in right here because you brought up audio and then you talked about, my recording space. So it goes to the comment of, is it just going to be an audio podcast or audio video podcast? Or if you would talk about that as far as what the formatting it should be.
Yeah. So in the last few years here, it's become really easy to just record video along with a podcast. If you're using podcast-specific recording platforms, like for example, the tool I primarily use is Descript. They recently acquired Squadcast, which is one of these platforms where you can record it. So if you're already paying, so you had to pay for Squadcast, you had to pay for Descript, now you just pay for Descript and you've got Squadcast. The only reason I don't use Squadcast is because it doesn't integrate with Calendly. And the Zapier integration doesn't do what I want it to do. So I am still using Zoom, and we'll talk about the settings on Zoom so you still capture the best audio on Zoom. But with something like Squadcast or its competitors, Riverside is another one that's out there. I think they recently were also acquired by some platform. I think Spotify may have acquired them. So now if you do Spotify for podcasters, you might get access to the previously paid features for free. That's like breaking news. That just came out. So why not? And so they all record video. You don't have to use the video, but they record the video. And in the editing tool that I use for my podcast, which is Descript, it transcribes the audio and or video. You could just edit the words like a Word document, copy, paste, even with AI voices. Is mastering the medium with AI after all. So you can clone your voice using AI, and there are some hot button fixes for things that get messed up or when you edit it doesn't sound right. You can just click an AI repair button and it's going to change the inflection so that strange edit that took out the now sounds like you never said and it went right and it wasn't even edited. So the AI tools are incredibly powerful, and it's like editing a Word document with AI, but it's actually editing a video and audio. And whether you're doing video and audio or audio only, it's going to edit both the same when you're editing this transcript in Descript.
And so what about, okay.
So you might as well record the video is my point.
So first question is, can I just use Zoom?
Yeah, absolutely. You could just use Zoom. So I pay whatever it is, $12 or $15 a month, but I pay an annual plan for Zoom. You want to make sure you go into your settings on Zoom. And I could probably spend 15 minutes just showing an example of all the settings you have to change. I do mention it in the deck, so definitely download the materials. But you go in your settings, and there are special recording settings that you want to make sure are recorded or are set up so that it's recording in the way that you want to promote the podcast. For example, turn off gallery view. Just make it so that you're just getting the person who's talking there. Now in Descript, you can edit it so that you get some side-by-side, or you could turn side-by-side into just one person talking, but then it's going to be more pixelated. The downside of using Zoom, the only downside is the video video quality is capped at 720p, which is less than HD, right? Which is less than 4K. And I've got a 4K camera and I'm recording in 4K. So like I'm not getting the maximum like video fidelity, but people are watching on YouTube or on their phones or anyway. So like, do you really need the super high definition? If you do, and that's what you want to do, use Squadcast, use Riverside. You're going to be able to capture higher definition video in those. But we all have Zoom. It's super easy. It's a low lift. It integrates with all the scheduling platforms, which you're going to want to use to book guests or even just to schedule time on your own calendar with someone in your office if you're doing an office-based format. So it's really low lift to use Zoom. Highly recommend it. Also, there are some other audio type recording settings in there that you're going to want to make sure are turned on. And a more recent feature is the AI summaries. So in Descript, you can just prompt it and say, hey, give me a 1-paragraph summary of this, because OpenAI has actually backed Descript. So like they have GPT-4 integrated with Descript. So you could query it or prompt it right in the transcript and ask for a summary. But if Zoom's AI summary is already turned on, you've got your summary as soon as the episode is over. So you might as well use that too. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be very directionally correct.
So you just drop that in speaker notes, or tell us how you use it?
Yeah. So for what I like to do, I mean, I knew this was going to happen. We are just like not anywhere where the deck is. So what I do for that is my show notes, which I only give detailed show notes to my Substack subscribers, because at the end of the day, podcasting is like shouting into the void. You have no idea, and the metrics are not great, and there's different platforms that have different metrics, and you could pay for certain integrations to get the actual metrics. But since we're not going to be professional podcasters, hopefully, you never know, the metrics don't matter as much, right? And so you can't track all that stuff, and you can pay for all that stuff. So what I'm trying to do is I try to funnel everybody into Substack now. This is relatively new for me. I was doing everything through Anchor, which was acquired by Spotify, which became Spotify for podcasters. And it was only in November that I moved everything over to Substack. I was dabbling around with Substack, and I also produce a local podcast for community theater in my community. And I did it with that podcast first to play around with it, loved it, and then moved my primary podcast law subscribed all over to Substack. And what's great about Substack is when you publish the episode, it sends an email at the same time to all of your subscribers who you actually know their name, unless they use a fake name, and you actually have their email, and you have open rates, and you have all the things that these like CRMs and other tools will give you. Substack's really like a super light CRM, customer client relationship manager. And so I really love using that tool for that reason specifically. And what I do is I say, if you want to watch the video, and if you want more detailed show notes, subscribe to the Substack. But how I make those show notes are, I've done it a few different ways, and I have it in the example workflow in this deck. But now I could just take the Zoom transcript, which, by the way, I also sometimes, if my guests want it, I'll share it with them, because especially if we're learning about interesting things, we're talking about things like, hey, you should do this, you should do that. I give a lot of recommendations for how my guests could use the subscription model in their practice. I'll just share those notes with them. And Descript makes it also really easy to have just a shareable link to just share the whole episode with them. And you could have an embed code, and you could use Descript to just embed your podcast episodes right on your website if you want to, if you didn't want to go the Substack route, because the videos are part of it on Substack. Man, I am totally digressed from where we were.
So let me keep you moving. So we've talked about recording space, and you dropped to everyone toward the microphone you're using. Let's move on to software. You've mentioned Descript. Anything else you want to add as far as how you're using that software?
I mean, it is the most powerful tool you could possibly use. I use it a lot in my practice. Maybe you guys see a show of hands who's heard of Loom and who's used Zoom to screen record like Loom. Just do it in Descript, especially if you're already going to be signing up to be a paid subscriber of Descript to use for your podcast. Descript is a far more powerful tool than both of those combined, if that makes any sense. But I do all of that in Descript now. And so another way that I use Descript, which is related to podcasting for lawyers, but it has nothing to do with podcasting, except I do it the same way that I record other things, is I will just go into Descript. And if you want to do a solo podcast, you can just do it all in Descript. And I should say, if you need to leave now because you want to go see another presentation, don't do that. But if you did, download Descript, subscribe to their YouTube channel. They will teach you everything you need to know about how to use it to start a podcast.
And so Descript, audio and video?
Audio and video. But what I'll do is, like, if I have a great meeting with a potential client, I'll go back, whether it's in person or on Zoom, I'll open up Descript, I'll turn on the recording, I'll make sure all the settings are right, because I have so many things plugged into my computer that, like, I had to make sure the right microphone and camera are on. And I'll just say, hey, Jane, it was great meeting you. I really look forward to being to help you with XYZ thing. If you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out. Something short and sweet. I might be a little bit more specific than that, but I try to keep it shorter than 1 minute. And what I do is I take that shareable link, because you could share this link, and you could also use this tool internally too within your firm. I take that link and I go into Canva, and I go to Canva's free QR code generator, and I take that link and turn it into a scannable QR code and also use a hyperlink. And I send off an email and sometimes a one-pager, depending on the context QR code. So it's either just a hyperlink in the email, or if it's like a one-pager because it's somebody who's going to give it to potential referrals to send clients to me. Maybe I want to give them like a PDF page with the QR code there, and it'll be maybe less generic and not, hey, Jane, but it'll be, hey, people who use XYZ service, here's how I can help you out. So you could really leverage this tool that you're using for your podcast, for your practice, in great ways. And when you record in the tool, it just makes it easy to edit it right there.
All right. So,
wait, hold on. Sorry. One more thing for Descript is, as you see here, if you're not musical, like I played on a keyboard the music for my podcast because I wanted to make sure no one can ever claim rights against it. So, and I'm a little musical. I mentioned the community theater thing. So Descript, what you're paying for is also licensed music, videos, GIFs, B-roll, all this licensed content, and you have none of that in the free version, some of it in the tier 2, and all of it in the tier 3. So you could just have, if you're not very musical, you can like listen to all the different, and they have, hundreds, probably thousands, maybe even like hundreds of thousands of potential content in there, and it's searchable. So you're like, I seriously typed in once, lo-fi hip hop elevator music, and found exactly what I was looking for. Okay.
I was going to say, I don't even know if I know what that is. But I will say that in looking at Descript, because you mentioned here the AI-powered editing, I did see a demo recently where someone had their podcast on there, and they went and edited like the first portion of it because they didn't like where it was, and then moved it to the back of the speech, and it pretty much moved the content and it integrated it seamlessly, which was pretty amazing.
And this is another great point. Sometimes when you're podcasting, you might have noticed a guest, if you're doing an interview-based show like I do, like maybe made a flub or said something that they clearly didn't mean to say. At the end of the recording, you could say, hey, I realized you said something that maybe you meant to say this instead of that. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, you could record it with them right there. Like, let's do a pickup. It's called pickups. So let's do a pickup, and you'll do a pickup of like, what they said, and you can say it in a few different ways, to make sure it sort of sounds right. But even with the AI tool, it kind of fixes it. And then in post, you just copy and paste it in place of what they said within Descript. So you definitely could do it with you could move the whole thing around, or you could do pickups at the end using the same thing.
So next, let's move to recording. Does sound matter?
Oh, yeah. So, we did kind of touch on this, right? And before we go, now that I'm actually looking at the slides, I do want to mention some other software. So again, I use Calendly. We'll give an example of that later. But another one I use is a free tool called OBS. And I forget what it stands for. And you got to be comfortable sort of tinkering in OBS. There are some YouTube videos that I had to watch to learn how to do green screen right using OBS. But here's why I love OBS is instead of relying on Zoom or Riverside or Squadcast for a virtual background, which they don't all let you have, I just put all my video feed through OBS on my platform, and I have all my different backgrounds that I like. I have different feeds for different cameras because I have a Logitech camera, and I've lately been using my iPhone 15 Pro Max, which has an incredible camera, just using continuity camera. And so I have all these different settings within OBS. And so if ever I have to be on Teams or I have to be on one of these other platforms I'm never on, because all my video goes through OBS, I always have my firm background on there, which, by the way, you make in Canva. And we talked about Canva. Card is a really affordable website platform that you could throw up a one-page website. With the exception of my podcast now, all my other websites are through Card. And then Claude has the largest context window. So if you're not using Zoom and you don't have the AI summary, you could take your transcript from Descript and you could copy and paste it into Claude and ask it to make really interesting show notes for your podcast that would make somebody, after reading it, want to listen to the episode. That's like a version of the prompt that you could give, and it'll bring down that summary. You can say, I want one paragraph, 2, 3. And then you could even take that and put it into ChatGPT, because I feel like ChatGPT is a little bit of a better creative writer. But anyway, okay, moving on to recording. Sorry, go ahead, ask me again.
Okay, so because I want to move to publishing too. So anything else you want to add on recording?
So check your own levels. So in Zoom, it depends on where you are. So in whatever software you're using, you're going to see like the decibels of whether or not something's being picked up and to what degree. Larger waveforms means that it's higher audio, but you also have to be conscious of your computer's input for your recording levels. So at least I use a Mac. I have an M1 Mac Mini that's like the most souped up version of that. I'm kind of pushing it to its limits now, but that has its own like sound settings, and they don't always line up with Zoom. So, or whatever other platform you're using. So you want to make sure that those are lined up and you're not accidentally recording into something that's like your microphone in your other room, because I have a microphone in the other room. So something to keep in mind. So always check your levels. I used to check my guests' levels, but because Descript has a tool called Studio Sound, which uses AI to do like compression and leveling and all these things in the background, and it makes you sound like you recorded in a recording studio, I care less about my guests' audio. I just tell them, find a quiet space, make sure you have headphones to prevent audio feedback, and I'll make it work in post. And then there's just a slider. So you turn on Studio audio sound. It's from 0 to 100. If their audio quality was really bad and they were in a really bad setting, then if you turn it up to 100, it's going to kind of sound robotic. So that's why the slider is there. But it will improve the audio quality of a guest that's in a bad space. So it just depends on how much work do you want to do with your guest before you actually just click record. I used to do that with every single guest, and I just found that it introduced too much friction into the experience. Question? Yes. Yeah. So there's a feature that's in, I can't remember what it's called, but audio engineers know what it's called, where in these like really expensive audio engineering tools that you can't just edit it like a Word document. There's a feature where like anything below a certain decibel or above a certain decibel, so like cat screams or like, like low rumble construction, you could just cut it out so that like nothing that's above or below those decibels come into the audio. It can be sometimes a problem because like if you're laughing, then you're accidentally going to get rid of the laughing too. And like everybody loves a good laugh on a podcast. So it's complicated, but there are ways to work around that, and it makes it better than not using this tool. Okay. And the question was to get rid of like background noises.
Dogs barking. And for those of us that have done hearings on Zoom, it's like, whatever's going to go wrong is going to go wrong right in the middle of your hearing. So baby crying, dog barking, delivery man showing up at your home.
Yeah, and make sure everything's connected, hardwired that you can. I don't have a mouse and keyboard connected because I actually keep all the devices that make sound and generate heat outside of my recording space. And so I do have a wireless mouse and keyboard and really long extension cords for everything else. But when I'm like for testing bandwidth issues, I always I just Google speed test and check to make sure I'm getting like really good internet speed before I get started. You hit record and you let the guests know whether the episode will be edited or not. Sometimes you could do a version of this where it's like just LinkedIn Lives and you don't edit it, and that's fine, super low production. But I like to go through it at least one pass and edit it. And usually when you tell your guests you're going to edit it, they're like, great. So they can make a mistake, and then the conversation's a lot better. I always count down 3, 2, 1. Because you never really say that during an interview. So in the beginning, 3, 2, 1, because I usually chat with the guest before we click record or after we click record before we get started. And I say 3, 2, 1 for me so that I know when I go into Descript, I could just look for the 3, 2, 1 or Control F it and just delete everything before that. And then whenever there's a flub or we're getting back into it, or like we made a mistake, somebody lost their train of thought, I edit all that out. And so I say, okay, let's pick up right here, 3, 2, 1, and like we get back into it. And I know I could go back to that spot, so I don't have to listen through the whole episode, but I do at 2 times speed, which very few of these other platforms let you listen back while you're editing at 2 times speed. You can listen back at 3 times speed if you're crazy.
Cool. We got about 15 minutes, so I want to hit on publishing and then give you all a chance to ask questions. So publishing, tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the deck has other platforms. You could do it. Substack. I mean, it's the number one. Like I even have some law firm clients that they know I do podcasting, and I've helped them for free because I want to keep them to stay a subscriber of my firm with like launching a podcast, and we're just doing it all on Substack now. It's super easy and it's a low lift.
So when we were talking before this presentation, we were talking about Spotify for podcasters. And we were talking about like, where does that push out to?
Yeah. So, I mean, it used to, when it was Anchor, you used to be able to publish on Anchor and it would just automatically put your podcast everywhere. It doesn't do that anymore. But whether it's Spotify for podcasters, which is great, it's a great place to do it for free. There's a lot of great features. They've just incorporated Riverside, which is huge, but it doesn't automate that sending that email that your episode went live, and it's still anonymous people. So if you don't care, if you're just going to be audio first, although you can do video with Spotify, then I highly recommend you just go with Substack. But what you have to do in any event, and Spotify has great resources on this and FAQs, Substack has great resources on this, and they have links in those resources of here's your RSS feed, copy it, and paste it into all the other platforms. And it doesn't take very long. You do have to make an Apple podcast account. You do have to make a Spotify account, especially if you also want those metrics and to do some unique things within those platforms. But everywhere else pretty much pulls from Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you just type in the RSS feed into those other platforms like Overcast, and it hasn't yet pulled your podcast from Apple Podcasts, it will at that point. So it takes a little bit of work these days, but it's still very doable.
So I'm going to throw you a curve real quick. If someone who's just sitting out here and they're like, I want to get rolling, like, what do you think the least cost that it would cost you to sort of get up and running on this?
I mean, nothing. If you're already paying for stuff for your firm, like the most expensive thing probably ends up being like storage, because it's a lot of data. Yeah, I mean, these are big files, right? Audio and video files, but Descript is a freemium tool. So there's a free version, I think an hour of transcription for free. Substack is free. Spotify for podcasters is free. There's free versions of everything. And if you already have a smartphone that's only 3 years old, you're good to go.
So you brought it up, and so storage. Let's talk about that real quick.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm paying $12 a month for Google Workspace for 2 terabytes of cloud storage. I'm also paying for the 2 terabytes for iCloud because I like things to be backed up in duplicate. And I do the storage that's on my computer, which is a 2 terabyte storage, and I have a 2 terabyte external. So I've actually got things backed up in quadruplicate. But you should just be doing that as a firm owner anyway.
So I will say on cost, I was doing when we were talking before and we went through this list and I was like, listing it all out because if y'all work with state bars, you know that we have a budget process and so we have to turn in numbers. I was like shocked at how cheap it was. I had to go back and like look up all the stuff again to say like, wow, that's pretty cheap. So it is not very expensive to get started.
And when you start paying for these tools, I pay $244 annually for Descript, right? You go talk to the vendors, they're going to be charging you $244 a month to use their product at a minimum, right? So, for us lawyers, it should be no problem for your firm if you actually want to use some of the more advanced features of these tools.
Okay, one of the next slides we have is going live.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of resources on this. We're all on LinkedIn, hopefully, but you could go live on LinkedIn, you could go live on YouTube. You could invest in a 4K camera grader, but if you have one of the recent iPhones or Android phones and you could do continuity camera, whatever the equivalent is for Android, there's a little, in my list of all the equipment that I have, there's a little thing, it's like a gripper that you could grip on your desk and you could position like a phone or a tablet, and I use that for positioning my camera. Zoom integrates for free with LinkedIn and it integrates for free with YouTube, but you can't go live on both of them unless you have like a higher paid tier on Zoom. And all the meta platforms, depending on if you want to do that, I think TikTok lets you go live, and YouTube just released a going live vertically feature. So on LinkedIn Lives, you definitely want to use a similar setup that you're using to record the podcast or doing Zoom Court. But for like TikTok and YouTube, sometimes you just want to do it from your phone because it's going to connect with that audience more that way. Restream and StreamYards are platforms that you could pay a monthly subscription to, and they will help you put up graphics and do a lot of other things. Ecamm is another one that lets you do that, but there's a cost associated with it. These are really more for content creators and law firms, so you could do this if you really get into it, or if you outsource it. Your outsourced providers may use these tools.
Okay, so, and not to sort of a play on words, but going live, starting, versus being live. So we talked about this a little bit before about having a recorded podcast versus a live podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm going to drop one more question so you can answer them both at the same time. The other thing is should I just start out and be live, or should I record a series of episodes and like sort of like get them in a can? What's your thought about those questions?
Both are decent strategies. If you don't want to spend a lot of time editing this and you compose, you're a comfortable public speaker, why not just, you don't even need to publish it as a podcast. You could just go live on LinkedIn, connect it to Zoom, yet you use some of this other equipment. LinkedIn's going to have that out there forever. I actually find that LinkedIn Lives have a really long tail. So even if you only have like 20 to 50 people who show up for the LinkedIn Live, you might get 1,000 views over the next month. So going live on LinkedIn is a fantastic way to grow the network. I have a lot of plans to do more of that in the coming future. So you could just do that, but it takes time to pre-record, and depending on how long you want to do it, like it took me 3 years to actually get to the point where I had enough guests and was used to recording episodes, and I discovered Descript before I had weekly episodes. And at the end of March, I'll be done with all of my production and scheduling for a weekly podcast for Law Subscribe for the whole year. But it takes a time to get to that point.
So it's kind of like the Gary Vaynerchuk, just start, right?
Yeah,
just
definitely.
Keep going.
Definitely.
So booking guests, that's our next slide. So talk to the folks about that.
Calendly is the app, is like the best tool you could use. You could use Acuity, you could use Google Appointments, Microsoft Bookings, but this is the actual language that I use. Again, not legal advice, but this is what I use. I've only had one person ever say, I'm not going to agree to this, because she was a lawyer and she's like, obviously I'm consenting, I'm here. So, but I still just make it like a clickable thing when they're filling out the Calendly. I don't ask a million questions. Low friction. It should be the same thing when you're signing up clients, as long as they're qualified, depending on what practice area you're in. Here's an actual example of what mine looks like. Again, these are all in the materials.
So your statement that you have in here, is that when you're booking guests, is that just through Calendly that you have it in there?
Yep, just like this. There it is right there.
Yeah, I would say that's something else too, if you're thinking about, because not that it was podcast related, but I was just shooting client testimonials, and so the company that was doing it was like, here, we need everyone to sign all these. And I was like, I just copied theirs, but what a great idea. So don't forget that. And I would even say staff, because if you're recording things and you want to use it in the future, it'd be horrible if someone who's working for you records something and then they leave and they're like, no, you can't use it. And so I would just say it's a really solid tip. And so
and also the textual format is important, because you might want to make a book related to something with your podcast. Should we just skip on? Monetization doesn't really apply to lawyers. I wanted to keep it in here just in case your podcast takes off and you become an influencer. So, just things to consider.
Go ahead. What I was going to say is just let's talk a little bit about what what you see AI, how AI you could use it on podcasting, because, we've talked about it a lot here at this conference so far, but just sort of getting your views on that before we open up to questions.
Yeah, so I talked about how I'm using Gemini to create a logo, and Canva has AI integrated features. Descript, the whole freaking tool is powered by AI. So it's one of these things where I think Descript is a great example of, right now, all the vendors that use AI say, we use AI. But that's going to be, I think, in the future, kind of like saying, we use the internet. Because Descript just is a totally powered by AI tool. If you're using Descript, congratulations, you're using AI. And they do kind of promote it, but not really. So another thing that I did for this other brand affinity related project that I'm working on for my firm is I used generative AI to come up with like 300 potential titles for these 2-minute episodes that I'm going to record. Or, there's going to be like, 100 like 2-minute episodes. So using it to come up with ideas for that, but the quality of the prompts mean that you're going to have a higher quality output. So so for logos, for prompts, for summarizing transcripts, for the editing process. Those are all the ways you're using AI in your podcast.
Yeah, I would say, what about coming up with topics?
Yeah, that's essentially, I told it what I wanted the podcast to be, and I need 50 episode titles. And I did it. I said, do it again, but make it a little bit more friendly. Do it again, but make it a little bit more serious. And you come up with a bunch of different episodes. Okay, synthesize all these into what are the best episodes that would make people in this demographic want to listen to it.
So I say this and I didn't even use it, but just so you know, I did load this PDF into GTP and then had it produce questions for me. I haven't asked him, but I'm just saying you can use it. So if you have material, it'll give you an outline. It'll give you topics to talk about. Literally, it's as creative as you want to be.
And so we'll open it up to questions, but I will say, if I've scared you from wanting to do it yourself, you don't necessarily have to. I know of, I mentioned Robert Ingalls with Law Pods. He's been on my podcast. They do it on the show floor is Spotlight Branding. I've been a guest on their podcast. They are a marketing firm for attorneys. They help attorneys with podcasting. There's another attorney I know. It's like Aaron Crane Productions, like Robert Ingalls. He gave up practicing law to help produce podcasts professionally. So if you wanted to hire a lawyer, I guess those are options out there. And even like Legal Talk Network, I know, does it too. And they've got a bunch of great shows. So there are options to outsourcing if you don't want to do it yourself. But at least now if you outsource it, a lot of what can go into the podcast, which will actually make you a better partner with those outsourced partners.
So now we come to the part of the program where it's Ask Matthew anything you've ever wanted to know. And so anyone have any questions? All right, let's start right here.
So it's a great question, and I'm mostly in Descript for the editing process, and I even I have templates in Descript. You could templatize things. So I have an outro and an advertiser because I do have a sponsored podcast. I wasn't even able to talk about getting sponsors, but anyway, so I have those as they're the same. My outro and my sponsored posts are the same for every episode until my sponsors change or I decide I want to update my outro, and I do custom intros. But what I do is you have to edit the whole thing in Descript because you only get one upload with Substack, and you can't really edit it in Substack. You can just record it into Substack. So you could if you really just want to get started, you could just go record the whole thing into Substack, but you're not really going to be able to edit it. So you do all the editing of the actual audio and or video for the podcast in Descript, and then when you go into Substack, that's where you could take the transcript summaries, you export it, and you upload it into Substack. And then you have the newsletter features and you have the podcast features, because when you click publish, when you're doing a podcast in Substack, not a newsletter, it also sends out a newsletter at the same time the podcast goes live. And you can make the show notes for the podcast in Substack different from the newsletter that actually goes out. And this is a lot of information. Substack has tons of FAQs on how to do everything. They want everyone to use it, so they're very easy to understand, especially for lawyers.
All right, next question, sir.
Okay, so the question was, can Descript do multi-camera? And for guests, not in Descript, but their acquired entity Squadcast does let you do it kind of. So right now, there's a button in Descript that you could click, like going live or like start a recording. I can't remember exactly what it is because I don't actually use it. And it will open up in a browser Squadcast. And then when you're done recording on Squadcast, it will automatically put it back into Descript. So it's not technically happening in Descript, but it's as relatively of a seamless process that it could be right now. They do have plans in the future to just make it an all-in-one platform, but it's not there now. Well, that's only remote guests. So yeah, I mean, this has been a remote-first podcast, guest-based presentation. If you want to do your own setup, that's a good question. I'm sure Descript has answered that in their knowledge base and FAQs. If you could do multi-camera setup, it's possible, but it's just not something I've experienced with, because if you want to do things in person, that's great, and you can do that, and we can talk about that. But if you're doing an interview-based show, you can have guests from anywhere. So you definitely want to know more people have use for the virtual recording than they do for in person. But I know like Aaron Crane, who I mentioned, one of his offerings is like you could come into our studio and you could record all there and he's got it all set up for you. So not all places offer something like that. And look, it's not cheap either, right? Multi-camera setup gets really complicated and expensive, but you can upload multiple video links into Descript and edit it from multiple shots. That I know you could do. Whether or not you could record it into Descript, I'm not sure about that one. I do some live streaming to YouTube and LinkedIn.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes. Ma'am, go ahead.
So I talk to most of my guests for around an hour. It usually nets a 45 to 55-minute episode. And it takes me half the time to edit that because I'm listening back at 2x speed. I've listened to like tens of thousands of hours of podcasts over the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm used to listening at 2x speed. Sometimes I even listen at 3x speed if it's like really slow talkers. But I'm listening back at that 2x speed. So it's only going to take me less than 30 minutes to edit those episodes. And plus with Descript, there's a one-click button solution for a lot of things. So like it's a one-click for delete all the ums and ahs, gone, one click. Delete all the dead air that's shorter than half a second, gone. And so like the first thing I do is I do those AI features and I shrink down the transcript size and I go to the 3:1, 3:2:1 and I delete those things that I know about in the transcript and I could usually shorten it down. So like 45-minute episode takes around 20 minutes to edit. And you don't even have to do that if if it was a good recording, you can note that in your notes that you're keeping while you're doing the recording. But because my topic is very niche and very nuanced, it's subscription, it's all about subscription legal services and disrupting the billable hour. There's a lot to cover, and my guests are tuning in because they want to learn more about that. So that's why I have more longer episodes. I think I have an upcoming project that's going to build brand affinity for my firm where it's going to be 30 seconds to 2-minute episodes, and it's just me, right? And so it depends on what's your goal with the podcast for how long the episode should be. But as a rule of thumb, maybe in the beginning, 30 minutes or less.
All right, we got about 2 minutes because I want to get you off for lunch and learns.
We'll go back in the slide here. So it sort of depends, right? Like, I mean, the ultimate goal is like, here are the quote monetization options, right? Because we're not trying to get people to pay us money just to listen to our podcast if we're doing it from a lawyer perspective. But like I talked about, like Robert Ingalls mentioned, you can make it a subscriber benefit. Is that your goal? That if you want to be a subscription-based law firm, this could be one of your member benefits is you get access to these audio and or video resources. So even if you're not putting it out there as a podcast, you could have like a knowledge-based database that you're recording in all the same way that's just accessible to your subscribers. So is that your goal, a subscription benefit? Is it just another marketing channel? And another thing I love about Substack is I am terrible with SEO. Part of the reason is I don't charge my clients enough that I could ever compete with SEO and spend and doing all that stuff. But with Substack, because Substack wants everyone to discover Substack and people publishing on Substack, it has done wonders for SEO for me. So even just publishing on Substack and using some of the right terms, and when you publish it, like if your goal is like just another marketing channel or brand awareness, using Substack with this podcast can really help like Google and other search engines pick it up. Referrals, right? So who are you going to be your guests? Are your guests going to be doctors because you represent their patients? Are your guests going to be restaurant owners because you do restaurant law? Or you're focusing on patrons for restaurants? Like there's all cool creative ways that you come up with who's going to be your guest because you're targeting those as potential referral partners. And if there's like any industry overlap, right? Another thing you could do is you could just interview potential clients. I get invited onto podcasts all the time because I'm a potential client of that person or provider, and I'm happy to do it. And you could invite, to the extent that it makes sense in the nature of your practice, for your personal injury attorney, it's a big public case. Maybe you invite that client onto a podcast to talk about how you won them a bunch of money, so, that's an option too.
Right, cool. Matthew, awesome. And so thank you guys for listening. That's our time. So I appreciate your attention. If you have other questions, come on up. But we do appreciate y'all. And now we're on lunch break.
Yeah, so we'll stick around.